Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to Hot Technologies. Yes, indeed, my name is Eric Cavanaugh. This is our Hot Tech Show, a partnership with our good friends from Techopedia. Hop online to techopedia.com for all the latest. In the broad field of enterprise technology, they of course cover consumer stuff too. We focus on the enterprise here in our program, so that's what we'll be doing today. There is a slide about yours truly and enough about me. Hit me up on Twitter at Eric_Cavanaugh. I love the Twitter. I love checking out that stuff. It's a great way to stay in touch with people and have good conversations and one-on-one conversations. So what are we talking about? This year is hot. This is a whole universe of opportunity that we look at today in the world of information management. And what we're talking about today is going to be queries, is going to be speeding up queries. I think I forgot to mention the title, Performance Plays, Say Goodbye to Latency. Well, who wants latency? Nobody wants latency. Latency is when you sit there, click the button, and wait for something to happen, and nobody wants that. The kids don't like it. They don't think it's cool. The adults don't like it either. We've all been spoiled by the speed of the web, and we want things quickly. We want things now, and we're going to be talking all about that today on our show. So, analyst Mark Madsen is with us today from Third Nature, one of our regulars. Our new data scientist, Des Blanchfield, calling in from Sydney, Australia. And then Bullet Manali, yes, indeed, that's his name. Actually, it's supposed to be two T's. Bullet Manali is on as our guest from Idera, a very, very interesting company. There's a lot of stuff I know about them already, one of which being they bought a company called Precise a while back. I knew their CEO named Zohar Gilad. How's that for a name? He was one heck of a smart guy. But, folks, you play a significant role in this webcast in the questions that you ask, so please don't be shy. Send your questions in at any time. You can do so using the Q&A component of the webcast console. That's down there in the bottom right-hand corner. You can also chat me, and I'll chat it over to the speakers. We already have someone calling in from Italy, so ciao, come stai? All right, with that, I'm going to push Mark's first slide. I'm going to hand the deck over to Mark. Mark, you now have the WebEx. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Eric. I'm not going to start in the middle, though. I'll start at the beginning. So just a few comments to set up the discussion with Des and Dara. Just a sort of state of the state with development and databases and operations. And, you know, if you kind of look at this, we have these sort of two worlds problems still in the database and application market, because developers view the DBAs as the people who hassle them. You know, you've got to build data models. You can't have access to that. You can't create that thing. You can't put an index on every column of every table in the database to make it faster. And of course, why do we need the model? It's just data structures. If we change them, can't you just write them out in serialized form? So, you know, the problem is that developers know code and applications, but two things they often don't know are concurrency and concurrent programming and databases and the operating systems underneath them. Having been a kernel developer in operating systems and databases, I can say that concurrency and parallelism are really hard. And so a lot of the things that you learn to get good performance out of your code really start to fall apart when you're working with the database. And performance looks great in the test environment, it looks great in the QA environment, and then it hits the real system, and then suddenly it's not so great because it's multifaceted. How the code works with the database, how it works with the environment, and really simple little practices can have drastic effects depending on which scale you're running. And when you start talking about external applications, of course, externally facing applications, web applications, can be really difficult because things are great until suddenly they flatline and they're not. And so you'll hit these interesting plateaus that require a lot of nuanced understanding. And the flip side of things is the DBA view, right? The DBA view is that their operations, they spend the bulk of their time, 80 to 90% in ops, and maybe 10 to 20% dealing with the development stuff that's going on up front. And so from this perspective, you either pay now or you pay later. And if you're spending all of your time up front, then you're going to have a much better chance later on, as opposed to development, which tends to be exploring a feature space and trying to figure out how best to do things. And so we have, we have problems, and now we have methodologies that are incompatible. Continuous deployment, rolling up your apps whenever they are ready, doing code pushes periodically. working in a shop that is practicing DevOps. This sort of thing speeds up development, but all of the practices around the database and what DBAs do and what system managers have been trained to do, the IT ops practices have not kept pace. If we think about it, most DBAs operate under a change control environment versus a continuous deployment environment. It's all about stability and control versus speed of change and reversibility. Continuous deployment, if you can't back out a change, you're in trouble. So everything has to be built to be easily reversible and code switchable, which is very not the way relational database development practices and management practices have worked. And so you're also running into these problems of having to be more proactive if you can as a DBA, because by the time you hear about a problem, 100,000 people are filling out complaint forms on your website. And that leads you to need some new things that you don't get out of your old environment. Things like better monitoring and alerting. And at the same time, databases have been multiplying. We've got more applications than ever to support more things than ever. They're inside, they're outside, they're all over the place. And more independent sets of data for analysis. People are standing up databases all over because, of course, it's easy now. You can set up a virtual machine. If you've got a cloud provider or an internal cloud, you can immediately pop things up, and this changes your entire procurement path, right? The old procurement path was, I have time to get a server, shove it in a rack, allocate space, get storage, get the database installed and do things, versus somebody swiping a credit card and going in 5 minutes. And if you do that, that modern development environment is operating at a pace that's very different. And so it's easy to create databases. And that just creates this problem of a proliferation like nothing we have seen before. And this has been going on for 10 years now. This is not news to anybody. But it also means that operating environments have grown in complexity, right? The whole client-server environment has really changed because it's not a client-server world anymore. Back then, you had a server, you had a database. If something was wrong, you knew which server to go to. You knew how to manage the resources on it because best practice was one database, one server. Virtualization started to break that apart. Cloud breaks it even more because what you think is a database server is just software. So the environment isn't real. It's what contains the environment that is the reality. And that might be a rack of blades or a big server carved up into pieces, and you don't really know. And everything around database administration and performance management with databases has been built around tight control with one server or a handful of servers and a couple of databases. You can't control everything. You're sitting there on a machine, but bandwidth cannot be partitioned easily by the virtual managers. And so everything can be fine with memory and CPU, but you're bottlenecked on some resource that can't be dealt with. And then when you try to fix it, the old model would have been add hardware, get a bigger server, do something like that. Now it can be really simple. Just add virtual cores. Just add memory to the VM, and it's solved. But what happens if your VM is on an overcrowded server and it needs to migrate? Or what happens if you are at the size of an AWS instance and the max size has been reached? Now where do you go? So you have all of these problems where the environment is part of the database now. You package an environment with a database, all its virtual resources, everything in the application. It's part of a configuration. The configuration gets pushed out there. This is in the database environment. It's a lot harder to manage and control. And so if you look at what the database vendors have been doing, they've been sitting on their hands. We've been moving away from this idea of treating databases and servers like pets. Servers have names. You treat them like they're individual unique things to treating them like cattle. Right? It's managing a herd. And the problem with managing herds is that if you don't control them, they eventually can stampede, and stampedes are not a good thing. And so we need better monitoring tools. We need better ways to deal with this stuff and know what has been affected. In the old model, it was easier because your ops panel, your control systems told you, but when your server name is a UPC code, it's kind of hard to figure things out. And so, you can't afford false alerts. You can't afford things that say, there's a problem with this machine, and that machine hosts 30 databases. You can't afford to have things give you no history. monitoring consoles are great when they light up, but if the red light turns green again and you don't know why and you don't have any history to go back into to look at what was leading up to that and what the context was, you're in trouble. And so we need systems that will monitor for us. We need better monitoring, dealing with the cursive intermittent problems that maintain that data history. Better things and simple metric thresholds that get us key metrics but don't guide us directly into what's normal, what's abnormal, and how frequently these problems occur. And so what we're really talking about is a combination of monitoring environments and dealing with performance, and the vendors have been sitting in their hands. Right? They haven't given us better tools. We have systems with more CPU and memory than we know what to do with a lot. And yet we still rely on manual intervention models. We haven't put the machine to work to guide us, to get us to the point of problems. We haven't gotten to, you know, this new style, which is there's a problem here, you can do this to fix it. Or there's a performance problem. It's actually with this specific SQL statement, here are 3 things you could do to fix that SQL statement. Applying heuristics, applying machine learning models that can look at the usage patterns of your system to spot problems and avoid false alerts. Using the machine to do what the machine does best, to augment the DBA or to augment the person who has to deal with performance problems. That's the new way, as opposed to the old style. There's a problem with this database. Things are slow. And so we have new techniques, new ways to do it, and we should be applying those. And that's where the market is headed. You're seeing it begin to crop up, not with the big vendors, but with third-party companies. And this is mirroring something that happened 20 years ago when the database vendors didn't provide a single thing to help manage the systems. So that's kind of what the direction of the market is. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Eric.
All righty. I'm going to hand it over to Des. And Des, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. So you've done a fantastic job of covering the technical component of it. I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle to highlight what's happened in the rest of the world as far as impact to businesses and the databases around them. So let me just jump to my first slide. So on the back of what you've just covered from the technical side of things and the developer side of things, I'm seeing businesses having to confront the challenge of data and databases in particular, and obviously we've had this significant shift towards this concept of big data, but databases effectively are still the heart and soul of where organizations retain their business information. And it's from front door all the way through to the back office. Every part of the organization is touched by a database of some sort and powered by a database. And very rarely do I go into either project discussions or some form of innovative strategic conversation in an organization where the topic of the database or a database system doesn't come up, and there are always questions around the types of things we've just heard about in performance and security, and how does development approach this challenge, and where do the databases fit, and how do our web environments and application environments talk to it? What about devices and mobility? So it's still a very, very hot topic, and it's been one for a long, long time in the grand scheme of things as far as modern technology goes. So to that point, I believe it's a fact that almost everything we do in our day-to-day lives, our daily lives that is now being supported by some form of database. When we think about all the things around us, whether it's a bill that comes in the mail every day for some service we're buying, it's invariably being printed by a system that's talking to a database somewhere in there. Our phones have databases on them with contacts and call logs and other things. Wherever we go, there's some form of database behind the tools and the systems we're using, and more often than not, they're fairly transparent to us, but the fact is they are there. So I thought I'd just quickly cover why this has become a bit of an issue in a very short period of time. So in the beginning, the concept of database came from this lovely gentleman, Edgar Codd. Whilst working at IBM, he changed the world as far as data management goes by creating a concept that we refer to now as a relational database. And when in the beginning the database was a database and life was good, it was fairly straightforward, rows and columns and references and so forth and tables. And developing software was pretty straightforward for it, and performance wasn't really that big an issue. It was all new exciting technology. We accessed the databases through some form of terminal, and you could only really create so much havoc at the end of a 3270 terminal on a mainframe, and invariably other types of terminals as other systems came along. And in most cases, the old style terminals were very similar to what web environments are now, and that is that you'd fill in a form on the screen on the terminal itself and hit enter, and off it'd go. It would shoot off as one packet as a request, and the back-end system would deal with it. That's effectively what happens in a web browser these days. When you're typing things in a web browser in a form, it doesn't usually go real-time back to the system, although with Ajax these days that isn't entirely the case. But then something happened. The future arrived, and more recently the internet. And almost yesterday, in effect, Web 2.0, and just around the corner we've got the Internet of Things. And in the process of the future happening, the world of databases just exploded, and the interactions with databases just became a thing that we all did by default. It wasn't a case that you would go somewhere to do something like buy a ticket for an airplane and want to travel to the other side of the planet, and somebody had to type in the terminal all your details and go into a database and print out a ticket. Almost everything we do now, whether it's hailing a cab on Uber with an application, whether it's jumping on internet banking, everything we do on a day-to-day basis with some sort of system is powered by a database. And when the internet came along, that was a little bit easier to bring to us our everyday life through a web browser, and then Web 2.0 came along, and things became mobile, and the scale of things just exploded. In fact, my favorite line in this topic is that the internet connected everything. Web 2.0 made it mobile and social, and things got very, very big. And now we have Internet of Things, and yeah, yikes. We haven't even begun to imagine the impact of the Internet of Things when it comes to the world of database systems. So in modern terms, what we used to think of as a terminal has effectively become these things. It's a mobile phone, it's various sizes of tablets, either personal consumer or enterprise-grade large-screen tablets, it's laptops, and it's the traditional desktop in some form. And in that one image, you can see almost every form of interface that we are now using to talk to database systems and apps that are powered by those, from the little gadgets in our hands that walk around and we seem to be glued to, all the way through to the slightly bigger versions and iPads and other tablets and Microsoft Surfaces, to everyday laptops, which invariably are now the case in professional environments and so forth. People tend to get a laptop, not a fixed desktop. But they're the modern terminal, in my view, and part of the reason that databases are experiencing all kinds of challenges in the management and performance part of our lives, and not just development. So I see them as one of the biggest challenges that business is still facing on a day-to-day basis. That, everyone thought databases were a solved problem. They're not. So what's all the fuss about? Well, when we go from one end of the spectrum to the other with all things related to databases, from a commercial sense, and Mark's covered the technical components very, very well, but in a commercial sense, when we, as an organization, we think about databases, we're dealing with things all the way from the basic design and development front end of when a business starts to think about developing applications, developing a capability, or even implementing an existing application in some form of design and development has to take place. And a great deal of thought has to be brought into how these database systems are going to be implemented and supported and managed, and performance is tracked and so forth. The integration of the database environments and applications and the types of APIs and the types of access that are being provided now are getting more and more challenging, more complex. Day-to-day administration, support, and backups. Again, these are things that we thought were solved, but then all of a sudden the scale got much bigger and things moved faster and the volume was so much larger. So that, the size of the environments that database systems had to support, the speed at which transactions are moving at, think about a database environment and a high-frequency trading environment. There's just no way humans can keep track with that. It's just a cluster of machines fighting another cluster of machines to do high-frequency trading, buying and selling. And the volume at which those transactions are happening, think of a modern-day scenario like an early release of a Netflix movie, where you're not talking about just hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of thousands, but potentially millions of people wanting to see that movie the very second it's released. and all of that information is captured and tracked and logged and analyzed in a database platform. And then there's, the always-on world that we live in now, 24/7, not just follow the sun, but, there's always somebody up at midnight wanting to do something, and business analysts follow the sun all around the world. So uptime and availability are by default a requirement now. Having an outage really just is an acceptable thing. And redundancy, if there is a performance issue or if we need a maintenance window to do an upgrade or a patch or security release, we need to be able to cut from one database environment to another and do it seamlessly and automatically. Security and standards compliance, we've had some pretty big things happen in the world of late, GFC in particular. And so we have a whole range of new challenges to meet around compliance and security and matching standards, and we need to be able to report on those in real time. And ideally in a dashboard form. We don't want to send a team of monkeys out to a data center trying to find things. We need the system to tell us that immediately in real time. And the two big fun ones that almost no one ever talks about, we generally push them under the rug and hope they don't ever raise their ugly head, but disaster recovery and business continuity. These are things as well that should, for the most part, happen automatically should the need arise. So we could spend days talking about the types of things that can go wrong in database environments and that humans generally have responded, but now we need systems and tools to do that for us. But one example is a data breach. And so when we think about databases, and I ask this question quite openly in various forums, what happens to databases when we take our eyes off the ball and something critical goes wrong, particularly if there is a system watching performance and security and other major aspects of running databases? Well, what can happen is this. This is a screenshot of some of the recent breaches in the last 2 to 3 years. Invariably, well, these have all come from a database system, and invariably there's been some issue in security or control or access that's come about. And in the top left-hand corner, we're looking at 152 million Adobe accounts where every detail of those customers was breached. Were it the case that the appropriate tools might have been in place to track and capture the incident and control security, we may have avoided some of those. The first couple of hundred records being stolen might have alerted us, and we would have stopped the next 150 million. So then, we get to the key point of this whole journey I've taken us through, and that is, why do we need better systems? Why can't we just throw more bodies at this thing? That we have well and truly crossed the tipping point, in my view, and certainly I believe is the case that's been evidence of late, that throwing more database administrators and more people at this thing doesn't fix the issue. We need a better set of tools and a better set of systems. And here are my top 5 reasons that I believe support this, and they're ranked in order of importance based on what I'm seeing across the small and medium-sized enterprise and state and federal government environments, the challenges they're facing with database environments and managing them. Security and compliance, number 1. Controlling who has access, where they have access, when they've accessed it, how often they've accessed it, where they've accessed it from, potentially even the device they've accessed it with, and the types of things they've looked at, and the compliance that goes around that. Have human beings run reports 30 days later to tell us whether things are okay just isn't appropriate anymore. It has to happen in real time. Performance and monitoring, it seems like a no-brainer, but invariably it's not, whether we're using open source tools or some third-party commercial tools. Invariably we haven't missed the boat in many ways with the types of performance monitoring that's required and the detail in which and the ability to respond in time. Incident detection and response, it has to be an instant real-time thing, and invariably we need a system to do it for us, or at least alert us quickly so that we can deal with it, so that the few issues that arise are dealt with quickly and don't cascade out of control. Management and administration, again, we think these problems are solved. They're not. The day-to-day issues that are being faced by database teams, particularly DBAs, where systems should be taking care of things for us, we haven't solved that problem yet. It's still a real thing. And, right from the front end, from design and development, when we start building these tools, we build the database environments, being able to throw the appropriate tools at development and testing and integration platforms. It still isn't an easy thing for us to do. This whole journey sort of drives us to this key message that, in my mind, we do need better systems and better tools to help us deliver the outcomes that we need from our database environments for the businesses that are deriving value from our customers. We can't just keep throwing more bodies and more DBAs at it. The scale is too big, the speed's too fast, and the volume is too high. And with that, Eric, I might pass back to you.
I love it. We've got a lot of ground covered there, folks. A lot of perspective laid. Let me go ahead and hand the keys over to Bullet in just 1 second. There
All right.
Let's take it away. And Bullet, now I'm handing it to you, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So I think a lot of good points have been made. I wanted to just quickly talk for just a second about the IDERA, who we are, and then we'll jump in. I want to talk about the tool that I think a lot of this stuff we're talking about, we can kind of set and kind of discuss some of the areas where these align with this tool, the Diagnostic Manager product. Now, what I want to do first is just kind of give you a little bit of a background about who IDERA is. We've been around since about 2003, and so we've started off with just SQL Server tools, and that's what we're going to focus on today would be the Diagnostic Manager product. But you can see all the buckets of things that we have here, and we've recently, as was mentioned before, we acquired Precise, and through acquisition we also have Embarcadero, and so we've got a pretty good portfolio of products. In terms of performance monitoring, in terms of SQL Server, the product that I want to talk about, which kind of aligns to a lot of these topics we're discussing, is Diagnostic Manager. Now, this is a product that's been around since pretty close to the beginning of days of IDERA, and I've been lucky enough to be a part of that since about 2005. And I've seen a lot of the changes in terms of SQL Server, you know, the shift from physical to virtual, all that kind of stuff that's happened, and also the needs of the DBAs as you know, the environments grow and those types of things. And so what I kind of started off with was, you know, the typical user of our product is the DBA. And so when we're talking to folks for the first time, prospective customers, it's mostly the DBAs we're talking to. We're not talking to the IT managers or the directors. It may at some point get to that level, but the initial kind of onset is that the DBA has a problem, the DBA tries to fix the problem, and a lot of times they'll go and download and trial the product as part of that. So either you get the data manager, the DBA, or the you know, the acting DBA, the guy that's lucky enough to be the most technical in the room in some cases. Now, when you get to the larger enterprise environments, obviously, then you're going to get the full-blown DBAs typically that will be the ones using the tool. And I went ahead and just added kind of a little blurb here from Wikipedia that kind of goes over the responsibilities of the DBA as Wikipedia says that's what they do. And so if you go through the listing here, a lot of these things, I'm not going to read it off, but you get a lot of the typical things you would think of. And then on one of them, you've got you know, monitoring and optimizing the performance of the database, and that's a pretty big one. And what's interesting is that when you talk to the DBA, they're always the ones that are blamed first when it comes to problems. And it may not be really their fault, but when there's a performance issue, typically with an application that is tied to a DB or database, they're the ones that get the blame. So they're always looking for the reasons why it's not their fault. And in a lot of cases, that's what they can use this tool, Diagnostic Manager, to help them do. But at the end of the day, also, if the database isn't performing, then a lot of this other stuff doesn't really matter. Your applications don't work, then it doesn't really matter for a lot of these things. So first and foremost, we want to be able to make sure that the user experience, the way we know it, is not diminished. It's something that DBAs are always striving towards. And I think that, you know, if you kind of look at the reasons why people typically buy and use the SQL Diagnostic Manager product, one of the first reasons, not the foremost or not, you know, not last or least, but it's kind of equal across the board, and depending on who you talk to, these reasons, almost one or two of them are always, there's some kind of need around. But the first one is just being able to have that centralized view of the instances of SQL that they're managing. The funny thing is that in a lot of cases, if you ask a DBA, how many instances do you manage, the number changes so often that they're not really sure in some cases. So you need something more than just being able to throw everything up on the screen. You want to group that information. You want to make sense of it. And so that's one of the things that Diagnostic Manager can definitely help with, is to be able to provide you with that kind of view into the environment. And it's not just a view into the environment, but it's a view that the DBA, the database administrator, is comfortable with, and it's a console that's kind of DBA-centric, if you will. It's made for a database administrator. There's plenty of monitoring tools out there. There's plenty of performance tools out there. But, you know, like I said, at the end of the day, the DBA wants a tool that's designed for a DBA, because there's a lot of things specific to what they do in their day-to-day. And with that said, you've got SCON, you've got HPO, you've got all these other technologies, but they want something that, like I said, is particular to what they're doing. And so I think that we can help in that area with this product. You'll see when we get into it in just a second. The other thing that we see with the DBA that is definitely one of the things we touched upon earlier as well is that they need to be able to see what's going on, obviously, and they need to be able to look across the entire enterprise and have some peace of mind in knowing what's happening. But at the same time, they're not sitting there staring at consoles. Remember all of those bullet points that you saw on that list that I just pulled up? They have to do those other things too. So it's not just about waiting for fires to put out. And so a lot of cases, they'll be in meetings, or a lot of the maintenance windows related to the database administrator are running in the middle of the night when they're sleeping. And so they have to have the ability to go back and see what happened. And in a lot of cases, if you don't catch something when it's happening, once the problem has gone away, at least with SQL Server, it becomes a kind of an issue where you're dealing with the situation where you don't have any remnants of that problem anymore. And those problems go away, and so do the remnants, which means that you have less to troubleshoot with, you have less information to work with. So with that said, that's definitely one of the things the Diagnostic Manager can help with, is to give you that view into the past, to query the information from the past. Did I have an alert with blocking? Did I have issues with deadlocking? Did we have things that were happening in terms of our resources? I can go back and query that information. I can drill into specific points in time. I'd be able to do all of those things directly from within the tool. The other thing that we hear, and it depends, some cases, depending on who it is we're talking to. A lot of shops, as was mentioned before, they go out and purchase the applications, their packaged applications. And then obviously other shops that we deal with, you get a lot of internal developed applications. Now, what I'll say about that is, in most cases, it's always a mixture, especially when you get into the enterprise level shops. But in some cases, you'll get, oh, we all have, it's just packaged applications. In some cases, it's all internally developed. But what's funny is that either situation, even if it's the DBA you're talking to, they still want to be able to see and correlate the queries that are running to what the performance of those queries is doing to their SQL Server environment. In other words, when the query kicks off, is it causing a lot of I/O, CPU? Is it taking a long time to complete? Is it causing a lot of waits that are occurring in terms of SQL Server wait types? All of those things, despite whether or not it's internal or an external application, the DBA wants to know, because they want to be able to see what is causing the problem. It doesn't really matter, if it was somebody that inside of the organization or somebody outside of the organization that wrote the code. They still want to be able to isolate it so that they know that the problem is happening and they know where it's coming from. So performance and accountability are a key part of what our product does. We can provide all of those details, and what's kind of nice is you have the ability to drill down. If there is a bottleneck, you can correlate that to the application, to the user, to the database, to the query. And once again, it's kind of a smoking gun. You get a direct correlation between when this query runs, what is it doing? And it's not just about the query itself in terms of it executing in and of itself, but also, is the query over time getting worse? And those things can be answered as well with the product, which is definitely something that, if you're trying to be proactive, it's nice to be able to say, hey, here's a query that ran bad, but boy, look at it, as it runs further, we can see it's running even worse and worse and worse. So, something I can do something about that. And so if we go into the next area here, and this is probably, I say this is one of the big ones. One of the questions I ask when I'm showing our product is, I'll always ask the database administrator, how do you hear about a problem related to your SQL Server databases? And it's very funny, because most of the time, now granted, most of the time they're looking at our product because in a lot of cases they're trying to solve a particular need. But it's interesting to hear, the initial kind of thing, at least with SQL Server, is that it was kind of the, in the early days of SQL Server, you had SQL Server and then you had Oracle, and everybody had Oracle, and SQL Server was kind of like the, for lack of a better expression, like the redheaded stepchild of databases when it first started. And then as Microsoft added more features to it, it became a little bit more of an enterprise tool. And obviously it's come a long way since then. But the point is that at one time you could argue that the databases weren't considered to be as critical back in the day, and that's changed over time. Now, because of that, a lot of cases people are trying to get their hands around it and saying, you know what, I've got all these SQL Server databases, I'm trying to get a handle on it, and rather than hearing about problems from the help desk or hearing about problems from the specific people that, you know, like the users themselves, they're looking for some ways to be able to go around that. They're looking for ways to be able to be made aware of those situations before they ever happen. And so with Diagnostic Manager, that's one of the things we're trying to do too, is at the very least, be able to make sure that the DBA is the first to know about those situations or those problems so that they can do something about it either right when they happen, or to take it even a step further, to analyze these systems that it's monitoring, and to be able to give you proactive advice that will improve the performance of that instance, and to be able to do that on a regular basis. For instance, we need to add an index based on the workload. Those types of things the tool is capable of doing as well. So we'll see a lot of that in the tool. The other thing, and the last thing that's on this list, which is kind of more of a general description, but it's something that's definitely worth noting, and especially as you get into the larger enterprise level types of situations where you got lots of instances, there's always going to be something obscure, some obscure thing that I'm going to want to monitor if I'm the database administrator, for example. And so what we try to do is anticipate in terms of what the typical DBA is going to want to monitor. With that being said, you would also be able to, you know, in terms of, you know, there's always going to be something new. So we've provided a way for you to add whatever metrics you need to monitor and manage after the point of installation can be added. So any perfmon counters, WMI counters, SQL Server counter objects, all those can be incorporated into the tool. You have the ability to add additional queries that can be incorporated into your polling intervals. And the last thing that is also worth noting is we can add and actually communicate with both vCenter and Hyper-V to be able to pull the metrics from those environments, because one of the things we've identified with the DBA is that they're typically not part of operations specifically, and they don't necessarily typically have, you know, the vCenter environments available to them, or and those kinds of things available to them. And so the problem is that if they're dealing with a SQL Server instance and they have been allocated resources, but that instance is virtualized, it may look like they have all of the resources in the world when they're just monitoring what's on the guest operating system, but the reality is on the host, there might be 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 other VMs that are trying to access and have contention of those same resources. And the only way to actually see that is to communicate to those other environments and to those interfaces, in this case, which we do. So you have the ability to add those other types of counters into the tool. Now, it's not just about being able to monitor those counters, but it's about being able to make those new counters that you introduce to the product, make them part of the tool as if they were an out-of-the-box metric, an out-of-the-box thing that you would want to monitor. So that means being able to incorporate them into their dashboards. It means being able to add them to your own custom reports, being able to obviously set thresholds and alert on them, but also baseline them and be able to set the thresholds with some knowledge of where to set them to, based on things like, you know, your baselines and what's normal. So you have a lot of those kinds of things that are also available in the product. So what I've kind of provided you with is the kind of the 6, what I call the core deliverables for Diagnostic Manager. And I can go ahead and just give you a little taste of that by going into the product. What I'm going to go ahead and do is share out my screen. Okay. And I'm just going to drag this over. So what you're going to see, this is the console for Diagnostic Manager. And as I mentioned before, going to that first core deliverable, being able to look at things from kind of an enterprise level view, there's lots of different examples of that within the tool. We have kind of a thumbnail view. We have more of a grid-like view. We also have, in terms of flexibility, we have a web-based console as well. And so the web-based console has other views that are available to you, like heat maps and things like that. But the point is that you have that ability to kind of look at and see things at a high level, but as problems occur, you're going to dig down a little bit further into the tool and actually see the specific problems and have some way to understand and know what's going on. And obviously that's very important. Now, in terms of being able to actually see what's happened in the past. If I'm looking at a problem that happened yesterday or a week ago, then that situation, you're going to have the need to be able to go out to a particular instance of SQL. And the good news is if you know what time that problem happened within the product, you can go directly to the history browser, and I can point to a specific time of the day. It could be from a couple of weeks ago. It could be from yesterday. But whatever day I choose from in the calendar, I'm going to then be presented with the different polling intervals, in which case now I'm effectively seeing what I would have seen if I had been viewing the console on April 20th at 1:37 p.m. So I'm able to go back in time, and then once I do that, all of the different tabs that we see here are going to reflect that specific point in time, including the queries that might have been running poorly, including maybe if I had sessions with blocking. All that kind of stuff would show up in the tool, and it's going to allow me to obviously leverage that historical information to be able to, to fix the problem. Now, on that note, when we're talking about the history, the other thing that's worth noting here is it's not just using the history for fixing problems. That history is very valuable, obviously, for other reasons. And one of the big ones is to be able to make decisions efficiently and to be able to make decisions quickly with the right information. So all of that history, all that information we're collecting, we can report against. So if somebody comes to me and says, I got this really great new application, it's going to change the world as we know it. Oh, by the way, it's going to require a database, and oh, by the way, it's going to really peg the I/O on the machine where that database is. If I know that going into it, then I can leverage that information to be able to provide a ranking of all my production servers based maybe on the last 7 days of collection, and I would be able to very quickly come to the conclusion of which instance makes the most sense to deploy that database on. So it's that type of historical information which is also obviously very valuable. In terms of the queries themselves, in terms of looking at the queries, we have a lot of different ways to do that in the tool. And the one I like to look at is the query weights view, because the query weights view is very helpful in terms of being able to assess if I have a bottleneck that's occurring, to be able to essentially identify all of the different areas that are affecting that specific, particular query. Not just the query itself and what the impact of that query is, but also, which application it came from, which session it came from, which user called it, and all of that stuff. I can view that, obviously, information in real time, but I also have the ability to look at that data from the past. And so that's one of the things here, and I kind of kicked off a script, but I got to wait for it to kind of pop up. So while we wait on that, I know we're short on time, so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit also about alerting, notification, being proactive. And when you're talking about that kind of stuff, like I said, the being proactive part, there's a lot of tools that do alerting. And so the alerting, the hard part's not sending an email. The hard part's not, writing to the event log or generating an SNMP trap. The hard part's knowing when to send that alert at the appropriate times. And so with that comes a lot of, having to do some calculations, having to understand what is it about that particular instance, and what is normal as it pertains to that instance. And so for all of the metrics that make sense to do so with, we baseline those metrics. So we actually we'll show you the baseline, we'll show you the thresholds that are currently set to, and then the other nice thing about it is that let's say I set my thresholds to, in this case, 6 and 10, just for this example. 6 weeks from now, if I come back to this instance, this baseline can completely change, because one of the things we're doing when we calculate the baseline by default is a rolling 7-day calculation. So it's always given me an up-to-the-date version of the baseline. And what happens if that baseline shifts up into my thresholds, in this case, I can see an alert recommendation that basically says, hey, you've got a threshold that's probably set incorrectly, specific to where we see the threshold being and obviously where the baseline is. You're probably going to be getting an alert for something that's a normal occurrence. And so rather than treating a symptom of something that's normal, I'm able to identify that type of situation where the actual threshold is set incorrectly. And what that allows me to do, obviously, is to set the thresholds in accordance to where I'm going to get an alert. It's something I know to be more of a call to action versus an investigation to see if it's really a problem. And I think that part of the tool obviously is really helpful in terms of the baseline itself and being able to calculate. Now, with this product, you have the ability to actually have multiple baselines. You can set them for different periods of time, and you can dynamically adjust the thresholds based on your baselines, which is also a very important part of kind of adapting to the changes that happen on a day-to-day basis to your SQL Server instances. Now, in this case here, we've kind of covered a lot of the settings of the thresholds and showing you the baselines, but as far as the actual alerts are concerned, the notification themselves, the cool thing about Diagnostic Manager is it does provide you multiple alerting profiles. So if you have, for example, an on-call profile that is from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., then I can have a profile specific to just that time range, and I can set all of the conditions and the appropriate settings here for my response. Now, the thing about the response is that in some cases, yes, I can send an email, or I can shoot off and generate an SNMP trap or write to the event log. There's a lot of other things we can do. But as I talk to DBAs, what they really, really like is the fact that in most cases, a lot of the work that's performed is repetitive stuff. It's stuff that they know exactly when the problem's happening, what to do to fix it. They just have to go and intervene. And so as you grow your environment, as you have more instances, that becomes a lot more difficult to do. So one of the things you can do within the tool that I think is worth noting is you do have the ability to set up a condition, but based on that condition to be able to set a response, to run a script, to run a job, to run an executable. And the point here is that if you do decide to run a script, I can use parameters inside of that script that will be at runtime, populated with the actual information. So if there are problems with a specific database, the script will be designed to run just against the database where the problem is happening. So you can dynamically address issues in an automated way, and then I can still receive an email to come back and tell me that, hey, there was a problem, but by the way, it was fixed, the script was run, and as the DBA, you know about it, but you didn't actually have to go and intervene. Now, on that same note about being proactive, obviously, we also have another feature in here, which is the Analyze feature. And what this will do is it'll do a regular check against the instance of SQL, and in some cases it'll do a deeper dive in terms of what it's looking for. Things like hypothetical index analysis will be performed. Do I add an index? Do I remove an index? And all those kinds of things obviously are going to help with my performance. But once again, it's all about being proactive. It's about being able to make decisions before stuff breaks and to make it run better. And so in a lot of cases, that's really what we're trying to do here. Going back to the query weights that we were talking about earlier, as you can see, there's a big spike here. I ran a script earlier that just caused some wait activity. And as I mentioned before, we have a really unique way you can drill down into this information. If I want to see what application it was, I can see it was coming from the OSQL application. We would be able to see the database it was tied to, the session, the user. And then if I want to, I can rank this in terms of my weights as well. So I can say, of all of the ranks that were, or weights that were happening in that window of time, which ones were happening the most? And if I see that one that's happening the most, the really nice thing is I can drill into that weight type, and I can see all of the commands, if you look here, that were making that weight occur. And I can also see primarily which application it was that was making that weight occur. So it sticks out like a sore thumb. I can immediately go and say, this is the application that's causing my bottleneck. Now, what was the query that was run? Which user ran it? Which database did it run against? And so on. So hopefully that makes sense, and it also helps in terms of making sure that you don't have the latency within your environment as it relates to your databases. So hopefully this is helpful. I'm going to go ahead at this point and pass it back, and I guess we can continue from there.
Sure thing. So I guess I'll just throw it out to our experts of the day. Mark, maybe first you want to comment and ask a couple of questions, and then Des, you can chime in.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed watching some of this. It's a much more intelligent monitoring than I'm used to seeing. I'm curious with the the managing of the data behind this, the managing of the metrics that you need to track to, look for things like shifting baselines in particular, that being one of my pet pain points with dashboards. How do you deal with that and with that data? And the second part of that is with baseline metrics that kind of shift. Do you have the ability to automatically shift the thresholds as well, so that I don't have to go back in and reset thresholds by hand when a baseline shifts?
You do, and so the nice thing about it is you can decide that. You can do either. I can set a threshold and make it a static setting, or I can check the box to say make this a dynamic threshold that will change as my baselines change. And I have the ability in the tool to set a default window of time for my baseline, but then if I need to, I might have a separate baseline window, for example, for my maintenance window from 2 a.m., let's say, to 5 a.m. Because I'm going to be taxing my CPU and my drives and everything else, because that's when we do all of our maintenance, it would then automatically, if I had it selected to do so, it would automatically adjust my thresholds to be outside of where whatever is normal for those metrics that I choose to do that with. It would allow me to do that. So basically you have an ability within the tool to set windows of time that are your baseline windows, and each window can be treated as a separate kind of entity in terms of the dynamic baselining adjustment that can be done. And you can add as many windows of your baseline as you need to, if that makes sense. So you could have a weekend window, a weekday during working hours window, a maintenance window that happens in the middle of the night, and so on and so forth. And I guess going back to the first part of the question, we do have and collect all of this information. I didn't really talk about the architecture, but we do have a back-end repository that you have complete control over the retention of that data, but we also have a service that runs in the middle of the night that goes and does all of our baseline calculations, and it takes that data, collects it, and makes sense of it. And obviously, along with that, you also have numerous reports that you can use to report against your baselines for specific metrics, and you even have the ability to compare your baselines of the same server for the same metric for different periods of time, so you can see maybe if there's differences that have occurred or what the delta is. So there's a lot of those types of options as well.
Yes. So one quick question I have for you. I mean, there's a broad spectrum of what this tool can do.
Yeah.
Are you seeing an uptake in the use of it in very early stages of development now, or is it still primarily a production environment tool? In other words, are developers getting access to this and using it through their early development and then testing and integration phase, or is it still predominantly used in production environments?
I'd say that, for the majority of the times, we see it in the production environments. It depends on the situations, but for the most part, I'd say primarily production, and we do, and it's also, fair to mention that we have different pricing for dev and test environments, so it's a little bit more attractive. So we do see people using it for those environments, but I'd say if I had to give you an answer one way or the other, I'd say it's primarily still production environments where we're seeing people making the investment for this product.
Sure. Yeah, and it was interesting to hear that you've got different pricing points because obviously there are different workloads, and the heavy end of town is going to be where all the real work's being done. But I'm seeing a lot of organizations, particularly in government and certainly in defense, where development now is getting the same level of investment in tools and systems as production environments because they are doing a lot more upfront testing. So in defense, for example, there are teams who run billions of tests, or hundreds of billions of tests on applications and systems and tools and monitor them before they even go into integration and testing, because they want to make sure that if the code they built in the database that's sitting under it, sure, it gets to the 101 millionth iteration of something whilst you're out in the field shooting at someone, it doesn't go bang.
Sure.
Is there in old school database world, in my experience, there's been a thinking that database environments are something that are just left in data centers and sort of are very rarely seen and very rarely spoken of. But when we get to the point now where tools and apps are being developed such that, particularly with analytics platforms, they're now in our handsets and our devices. Are you seeing clients bring the conversation of database performance and database management sort of in more of a day-to-day discussion as opposed to just purely techies? I mean, I know you mentioned before that predominantly you're talking to DBAs, but is there a trend now where it's in the general vocabulary you're seeing people where they're discussing these topics as opposed to just the geeks?
Well, it's a tough one to say. I mean, like I said, for the most part, the people that we deal with in terms of the selling process anyway is with the practitioners, which are the DBAs. So I think in terms of your question, are you just saying in terms of generally the people within the IT organization, are they becoming more database aware, I guess, is the question? And I would say probably the answer is yes. I probably don't see it as much based on where I am on a day-to-day basis, but I think if I'm understanding your question, if that's that would be my answer, I guess.
Yeah, that's okay. It's probably a loaded question, sorry, because obviously your predominant audience in your world is the technical side of things. That I'm curious in that in my day-to-day activities now, I'm seeing organizations start to bring this into the conversation very early. So when they're talking about new initiatives, new projects, new programs of work, one of the things that come up immediately is how we're monitoring it, how we're tracking it, how we're dealing with issues as they arise, as opposed to launching, going live.
Yeah, I would say that. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that.
Yep.
I was going to say that I do see a trend, I guess you'd say, and you know, a lot of times in the past you'd get, hey, yeah, we had a problem, and so now we need a tool. And I think that we are seeing a little bit more of a acceptance around having the tool in place before the problem happens, if that makes sense. So I would say that's definitely becoming more normal to be, you know, hey, we need a monitoring tool, we need something. And people are definitely seeing the value of this product because, like you said earlier, that buying or having just adding DBAs and adding new instances, it's not, you need something that manages that. You need something that helps with the management of that, and that's why we're seeing a lot of, I think, acceptance around this product as well, or we have.
Yeah. Quick question, where does this need to live? Does it have to sit right on the backbone, on the LAN, within the data center as close as possible to the database environments, or is it comfortably placed somewhere just, you know, potentially out in the cloud and a third-party cloud with some sort of either you know, VPN tunnel or remote access to various environments? Where does it need to sit as far as the environments it's monitoring are concerned?
In terms of the architecture, there is a back-end repository, and that's a SQL Server database. We have the console, which can either be a fat client or a thin client. We give you the option of both. And we also have a thin client that's really geared specifically to mobile devices as well. But in terms of where this can actually sit, it can sit in an environment. Really, the trickier part about it is, and from a lot of the information we need to collect does require administrative rights in some cases, or in a lot of cases. Now, we don't make you do that. If you want, you can collect data and just for the things that we can't gather because we don't have admin rights, we will just let you not see that information if that's the choice that you make. So depending upon the flavor, like if you're talking about AWS, some environments it works better than others, but as far as the actual environment itself, typically either using SA authentication to collect the data against the instances is all that's necessary, or you know, if it's an untrusted domains, that's usually when you'd want to do that. But multiple domains, as long as there's a trust between them, we can collect against those. So it doesn't really matter if it's on a LAN or if it's on the WAN. The actual collection itself it's pretty negligible in terms of the amount of data that we're collecting. If we have a sufficient size WAN connection, it's not a problem. I've seen environments where they have you know, branches where they have SQL servers all over the United States, and it's one server on each of those different locations, and they're monitoring it centrally. The tricky part is just making sure that you have a decent amount of connectivity to do that. Hopefully that answered your question. It was kind of all over the map.
It does. No,
the answer.
Absolutely. Thank you. So two quick questions that have come through from attendees this morning. One is, what's the impact? You know, often we see system monitoring tools generate load themselves by just monitoring things. So the question was, sorry, it scrolled off my screen now, but just to paraphrase it, by monitoring, are we generating load ourselves? Is there a measurable impact of the tool just watching the environment, or is it a fairly, you know, is it a negligible impact?
Yeah. So there's going to always be a little bit of an impact because of it has to query the SQL Server instance to pull back the data. The question, like you said, is it negligible or is it significant? Out of the box, if you're pointing to an instance, it's negligible. We've been doing this for, like I said, quite a while now. We've got like over, I think, 20,000 customers, and I can assure you that if it causes significant performance impact, we wouldn't be in business. With that said, we also allow the user to decide what they want to monitor, and so I think that's an important thing to mention, is that every environment's a little bit different, and so like an example would be with the query monitoring component, one of the things we have the ability to do is we can set the threshold of what you consider to be your boundary of normalcy. So it could be based on time of the execution of the query, it could be based on CPU, I/O, but as an example, let's just say I set my time of execution to 0 milliseconds. Effectively, what I'm telling the tool to do is to collect all of the queries that ran since the last polling interval and make that part of my historical collection as well. Now, when we do that, we're going to collect whatever amount of queries were running on the box since the last polling. Now, that's elective, and the user has the ability to do that. Do we say that that's what you should do? No, but we also give you the option to do that in case you want a sample of data that allows you to collect that information. So generally speaking, you have the means within the tool to set it up and tune it exactly how you want based on what you're comfortable with. But you do have the ability to really open it up if you want to and collect a lot of additional information that you might not necessarily regularly collect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we're running a little bit long, but there are two really great questions I want to throw at you before I wrap up that I'm from folk. In fact, both come directly to me, but I think it's best if you answer them. The question generally was, what's the scope of the tool's reach as far as knowledge of existing systems? So can we just plug this in and have it automatically detect the platform that's there and know what's normal for that platform and immediately pick up, as Mark was talking about earlier on, some of the baseline knowledge of the platform? So if I'm putting into, I don't know, it could be Microsoft Dynamics, BI tool, what's the scope of the knowledge of the platform with what's normal and some of the current off-the-shelf tools that are being used around business?
So I would say that, generally speaking, when we start collecting data on the SQL instance, we work with best practices to begin with in terms of our thresholds and where they're set to. That said, we also recognize that whoever you're talking to in terms of best practices, every environment's different. So what we'll do is initially we just collect the data, and what we recommend people do, you can trial the product for 14 days, longer if you need to, but after about 2 days, you'll start to see the baseline data populate. So once it has enough sample information to work with, then it will start providing you the context in terms of the baseline, where the range is, and all that kind of stuff. So then from there, if you want to, you can automatically set your thresholds from that information that's been collected. So it does take a little bit of initial collection and polling to be able to start to determine what is normal so that you can start shifting your thresholds. But the thing that I think is worth noting as well is that when you change those thresholds, it can be done on a group-by-group basis of your instances. It can be specific to one instance, or you can do it against all of your instances, as well as the ability to create things like templates so that you can say, this is a production instance, so this is the template that I want to assign to it. And so when a new production instance comes online, we automatically apply those thresholds to it because it has the same type of hardware and it usually has the same workloads, so we would be able to do it that way as well. So hopefully that helps in terms of the question.
It does, absolutely. In fact, you actually answered another question that just came into me, and that was, is there a trial download? There is. I can answer that, I know, but I'm sure you'll confirm that there's a free download, and I think you said it was just 14 days from the website. You can download it and have a play with it. I guess just quickly with that, though, what kind of environment do I need to be able to run the trial? Can I run it on my laptop and play with it, or do I really need a server?
The main thing it needs is a repository, a SQL Server database that's 2005 or above. Other than that, there's some minimal resource requirements, a .NET requirement, and that's it. So just a matter of installing the product and creating a database.
Perfect. So one last question that I'll throw at you, because I know we're just over time now, but quickly, someone, in fact, about 2 or 3 people asked me, do I need to be a DBA to actually be able to get up and running with this and have a play with it? And or can no? Okay.
I would say that if you're a DBA, you're going to have different uses of the tool. I mean, there's going to be probably a little bit more value. If you're a seasoned DBA, you're going to see a lot more. There's a lot more depth to the tool that you'd be able to take advantage of. But also as a new DBA or even a person that's not a DBA, we do have a lot of recommendations, and I'm on that page right now. So these recommendations will come up on a regular basis. And the really nice thing about the recommendations is they provide you with the reasons why the recommendations are being made, but in addition to that, they also will have links to external content that describe more in detail about the reasons why those recommendations are being made as well. So that'll link to external Microsoft websites, blogs, and all kinds of stuff like that that's external. But to answer your question, it's kind of, you know, like I said, if you're a senior DBA, there's going to be stuff in here you'll probably take advantage of that you probably wouldn't as a, you know, novice DBA. But then at the same time, it's kind of a learning tool as well, because as you go through these recommendations, you'll start to pick up some of these things on its own through the use of the recommendations.
Fantastic, thank you. Look, I really enjoyed the demo part. I mean, the presentation was great. The demo was fantastic. Just quickly, from memory, there's a whole resource center on your website that I recommend people have a look at as well. I remember going through that last night, some detail together, but you've got a whole range of things just from your blogs and day-to-day conversation through to, from memory, you've got most of your product documentation online as well, yeah?
Yes, that's correct. And the forum I think that you're referencing is the community.idera.com website. And then one thing I would mention also is that earlier you'd asked about is it going to recognize the environment? So, you know, in terms of new instances or adding instances, there is another tool that we have which does discovery of instances, and it's all about inventory and managing your inventory. So I would just kind of point you in that direction in terms of actually discovering the instances. But as far as actually the performance and monitoring and all that kind of stuff we talked about, that's where the Diagnostic Manager would come into play.
Fantastic. Look, great coverage. Really enjoyed the presentation. Loved the live demo. And that's all from me this morning, as I know we've gone probably 10 minutes over time. Eric, I'm going to pass back to you.
All righty. I just love the demo. I'm glad you did the demo. I'm glad we got to take a nice hard look at that as we went through the Q&A.
Great.
Because this gives people an idea of what you're looking at. And you know, it really does kind of amaze me to think that we're still learning about how to talk to these computers when you get right down to it. I mean, this level of diagnostics is pretty sophisticated, and it's getting better every day. We're getting a lot more insight into what's actually happening, but you really do need a person overlooking this stuff, reading it, putting that cognitive ability behind what you're doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, I mean, I wish I could tell you this is a DBA in the box, but it's just there's too many things that are going on. I mean, we do provide guidance and we do help out, but at the end of the day, it requires people making decisions about the data that we're presenting. And so, you know, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, well, that's good news for the real people out there, folks.
That's right.
You're going to want to have someone watching this and a team watching this, and you'll learn, as you heard from Bullet here, looking at these recommendations, you're going to pick up what's going on. And I'm guessing from that history, and I think you touched on this, Bullet, but very quickly, that history allows you to recognize significant patterns and then, therefore, be able to identify when they may happen in the future, right?
That is correct. Yeah, so one of the things we can do is track a query's performance over time. We can also obviously look at other things like baselines and see them shifting, and obviously get alerts and things like that when that happens. So you definitely have that ability.
That sounds good, folks. We went a bit long here, but wanted to get to those questions. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We do archive all these webcasts. Hop online to techopedia.com or to insideanalysis.com. You'll see links from both places. And with that, we bid you farewell. Thanks again, folks. We'll catch up to you next week. 3 more webcasts next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So we'll talk to you next week, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.